All right, so this is chapter 10 notes, part 1. We're going to go over composition of blood and talk about formed elements, which are the living cells in blood and their functions. Let's see if we can get it to go to the next slide here. Oh, there we go. Sorry. It's being a little glitchy. All right, so blood. Blood is the transport medium for a variety of things throughout our body. The blood vessels are like the highway, and the blood is a vehicle that transports nutrients, waste, hormones, antibodies, ions, all sorts of things. And also helps us maintain our body heat because blood is at a higher temperature than what our homeostasis of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is. A healthy adult has about 5 to 6 liters of blood. So if we think about liters, how many milliliters are in a liter? So you've got 1,000 milliliters in a liter, like that graduated cylinder. And if you look at, some of you guys may have some water bottles or things like that, so you want to be looking for 1,000 mLs, and then you times that by 5 to 6, and that's how much blood you have coursing through your body. Your body makes about an ounce of new blood a day, which is kind of interesting. Blood accounts for about 8% of your total body weight. That picture right there is a picture of red blood cells. They kind of look like donuts without the middle punched out. So what is in blood? So as I mentioned in the questions, like the intro questions video, blood is a connective tissue, and that means that it is a combination of living cells with non-living matrix. Blood is fluid because its non-living matrix is water, okay? It also lacks collagen and elastin, which would give something its solid form. So again, formed elements, which are living cells, and we have 3 main types. And plasma is the non-living fluid matrix, which is mostly made up of water. Here are our 3 main types of formed elements, or living cells found in blood: erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. And erythrocytes is the fancy term for red blood cells. Leukocytes is the fancy term for white blood cells, and platelets, well, we can call those thrombocytes. And then finally, plasma. So this is the non-living matrix. What do we find in there? Well, it's about 90% water, and then there's literally over 100 different things that are dissolved or carried in that. We have salts like sodium and potassium, calcium. We have different plasma proteins, and the plasma proteins are actually really important, like albumin. Those plasma proteins actually help us retain water in our blood so that it wouldn't all seep out and go into the cells, because the cells are pretty hypertonic, relatively speaking. Fibrinogen is actually a protein that helps us create a clot. And globulins, that's the short form for immunoglobulin, which are antibodies that are proteins. Nutrients like glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, different vitamins, wastes, nitrogenous wastes, respiratory gases, so that would be, oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then hormones. Hormones are carried throughout the bloodstream as well, specifically in plasma. That's just a cross-section of a blood vessel, and just seeing the menagerie of things in there in terms of formed elements. So the white blood cells, which are right here, it's like a monocyte to me. Red blood cell, and these little spiky things are platelets. Interesting things about our formed elements is that white blood cells are actually the only complete cell. Red blood cells are missing some things, and platelets are actually cell fragments. Some characteristics of blood. Well, blood has a sticky, opaque substance. It's a little more viscous than water is. Why? Because it's got those formed elements in it. It's got a metallic taste because of the iron and hemoglobin. If it is saturated with oxygen, if its hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen, it's going to look bright red. If it's oxygen poor, it's going to look like a dull red, dark red color. The pH is between 7.35 and 7.45, and that is really tightly regulated. Going too low, going too high, like, you know, a 0.2 change could really be catastrophic for somebody. And then I talked about previously how the temperature of blood is 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. And a true fever is really considered anything above 100.4 and above. And that will help us maintain our body temperature. So when blood is taken out of a person, what they're going to do with that most times is they're going to put it through a centrifuge, and that's a machine that's going to spin the blood, and it's going to break it down into its different components. And when you spin the blood in the centrifuge, the heavier things go to the bottom, and the less heavy things are going to be at the top. So in spun blood, the red blood cells are going to be down at the bottom. There's going to be a really thin layer above the red blood cells, which we call the buffy coat. And in that layer is going to be where the white blood cells and platelets are. And then above that, the majority of blood, over about 55%, is going to be the plasma. So about 45%, a little less than 45% of blood is red blood cells. A little less than 55% of blood is plasma. And that leaves about 1% left over for white blood cells and platelets. So in here we've got, so this is not what blood looks like when it comes out of your body. This is after it is centrifuged or spun down. So at the bottom we have our red blood cells, all right? There are about 5 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood. So per drop of blood, essentially, you have 5 million red blood cells. In the buffy coat, this little thin thing here, okay, we have two different things. You have all of your white blood cells, which is anywhere, you're going to see different ranges. Here it says 7,000 to 9,000 per cubic millimeter of blood. A healthy range that I say is 4 to 11,000. With platelets, you're going to see anywhere from 250 to 350,000. Again, this is all per drop of blood. And the cellular components, our formed elements, together make up about 45%. Then finally, the top layer here is plasma. Plasma is about 55% of our total blood volume. It's mostly water, over 90% water. About 7% blood proteins. Remember I told you that blood protein albumin was important because that actually helps us keep fluid in our blood, and water doesn't just, you know, go through osmosis and come out of the blood vessels. And then the rest is a whole hodgepodge of things, of nutrients and electrolytes and respiratory gases and hormones. But the majority of blood, all right, is plasma. Again, and that's 91% water. That's why blood is fluid. All right, so let's get into the jobs of our formed elements. Erythrocytes, or red blood cells, their job is to carry oxygen, all right? They're small, they're disc-shaped, they look like a donut without the center cut out. Again, we have about 5 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood, and the number of red blood cells found in blood is called their hematocrit, and it's got to be a certain normal healthy value, and it's different for males and females. Something interesting about red blood cells is that mature red blood cells actually are anucleate, and they lack mitochondria. So a baby red blood cell, or a young red blood cell, which is called a reticulocyte, is born in the red bone marrow, and as it is about to go out into circulation and become a true adult red blood cell, it's going to reject its nucleus, and it's going to reject its mitochondria. If it rejects its nucleus, one thing it cannot do is go through mitosis, so it cannot divide. So that means that red blood cells don't divide out in the blood, they die. And where they die is actually the spleen. The spleen is the graveyard for blood cells. They lack mitochondria because mitochondria uses oxygen to make ATP. And if they were using oxygen to make ATP, they would be like the scary guy from the Lord of the Rings, that guy Smeagol with My Precious. It would not want to let go of oxygen if it used it to make ATP. So they only rely on anaerobic respiration. And because they are doing anaerobic respiration, a byproduct of that process actually helps determine what somebody's blood glucose level is for about 3 months, because red blood cells live for about 3 months, and that number is called an A1C. It's a lab value. Hemoglobin is actually the molecule inside of red blood cells that carries oxygen. Hemoglobin is a globular protein, and it has 4 hemes on it, so 4 iron-containing things, and each of those hemes can bind to 1 oxygen. So every 1 hemoglobin molecule can bind to 4 oxygen molecules. Every red blood cell has about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. So if each 250 million of those hemoglobin molecules can bind to 4 oxygen molecules, that means that 1 red blood cell can carry 1 billion oxygen molecules. That's pretty crazy. I told you before that there was a value with hematocrit, but we also want to look at the amount of hemoglobin that's in somebody as well. And again, males and females have a different amount of hemoglobin. So this basically determines your oxygen carrying capacity. Here's a little cross section. So here we have some red blood cells, and then there's some platelets spread out between there. So this is showing the disc-shaped red blood cell. This is a close-up of hemoglobin. Again, it's a globular protein, and then it's 1, 2, 3, 4 iron-containing molecules or hemes that can bind to oxygen. Leukocytes are white blood cells. We have about 4,000 to 11,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood. It's less than 1% of our total blood volume, and their job is to fight off infection. Infection diseases, cancer cells, tumor cells, all sorts of things. White blood cells are the only complete cells, meaning that they contain all normal organelles, unlike red blood cells, as I just mentioned. And something cool about white blood cells is that they can do something called diapedesis. Diapedesis means that they can move through tissues. They can move out of the blood vessels. They can move through different organs. They can move through interstitial space. Red blood cells cannot leave vessels. When the red blood cells leave vessels, that's called bleeding. You don't want that to happen. But white blood cells can do this cool thing called diapedesis. When a leukocyte is responding to a dead cell, a dying cell, some sort of infection or injured cell, cells basically communicate via chemicals, and when they give out chemicals and they call, so like an injured cell gives out a chemical and calls for white blood cells to come to their aid, that's called positive chemotaxis. And the way in which the white blood cells are doing that diapedesis is called the amoeboid motion. So they basically use these cytoplasmic extensions to kind of grab and pull, and get themselves around the body. When you have an acute infection going on in your body, or maybe some type of blood cancer, you could potentially have a white blood cell count of higher than 11,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood, again, per drop of blood, and we call that leukocytosis. Somebody who, say, is dealing with something like HIV could be dealing with leukopenia, which means that you have fewer than 4,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood. This is a cross-section of different, so this will be under the microscope, of different types of white blood cells. So as you can see, these little red things are the red blood cells, and then these are all our 5 different types of white blood cells that we're going to learn about. And that's just another microscope look at our white blood cells. So white blood cells, as I said, are broken into 2 different classes. They're either granulocytes or agranulocytes. Granulocytes mean they have granules. Agranulocytes means they do not have any staining granules. And these are our 5 main ones. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3 granulocytes and 1, 2 agranulocyte. Our 3 types of granulocytes are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Neutrophils are our most common white blood cell, and they are responsible for eating stuff. Eosinophils come out in response to allergic reactions, and basophils are really rare, and they produce histamine. Agranulocytes, we have 2 types. We have lymphocytes and monocytes. Lymphocytes are really large, and they have a big oval-shaped nucleus. And then monocytes they have a U-shaped nucleus, and they're actually like professional Pac-Man eaters. This is looking at lineage, which I will